This is the giant Mouse Ace Biblio, which is a fantastic EDC with a few serious caveats. This is ClarkeTheKnife, and we're going to go through this knife in 5 sections. First, we'll talk about specifications with an overview of the knife and talk about what it's designed to do. Then we're going to talk about what it does well within its intended application. Then we'll talk about some struggles and where it falls short. We'll discuss fit, finish, and value, and then we'll end with concluding thoughts and an overall recommendation. So let's get to it. Specifications. So this is the Giant Mouse Ace Biblio. It's one of the first designs from Giant Mouse. By this point, it's at least a few years old. So Giant Mouse has 2 lines. They have their Ace line here and their GM line. I did a quick first impressions on the GM11 not long before this, and I've done plenty of Ace knives and have a few more still to do. So their GM line, those are limited production knives, a few hundred of each model. And those serve 2 purposes. 1, they're more high-end collector piece, and 2, it's where Giant Mouse tends to sort of pilot most of their designs. They will try something in the GM line, see if it sells well, and either modify the design or bring it relatively unmodified into production in the Ace line once they know the design works. The GM1 was, as you would expect based on the name, the first of the GM line that Giant Mouse came out with. And the Biblio is the full production version of the GM1. And when I say full production, there have been many hundreds, if not thousands, of these knives produced and sold over the years. This design has also gone through a couple iterations. This is what the first set of Biblios all looked like, with these thick, contoured micarta handles. They also made some versions. So, yeah, just to go through the versions, you can get this with micarta handles. You can get it with a bunch of different micarta handles. There's at least been OD green micarta, natural micarta, red linen micarta. This is maroon micarta. You can get green G10, black G10, a few other G10s. And then they also made later slab-sided versions of this with titanium, bronze, brass, and then bronze with inlays at minimum with some different anodization, some different blade coatings. Basically, there's like 15 versions of the Biblio out there. Most of them are a little hard to get your hands on right now because a lot of those have been discontinued, and sort of all that's left is either what's on the secondary market or what's still hanging around at various retailers. I wouldn't be surprised if a Biblio V2 comes out at some point, and as I'll get to in my review, I would love to see a Biblio V2 at some point, but the fact is, when you see a Biblio, 90% of what I say in this review is going to apply to any Biblio out there, and it'll be pretty clear where certain caveats might apply more or less to certain models. It's one of 3 knives in the Biblio lineup. I've only got 2 of them now with me. The Riv, which came out a couple of years ago, is a baby Biblio. And then the other one, which I don't have yet, is they just came out with a Biblio XL, which is a giant Biblio. But considering this a relatively small knife, even that one isn't all that big. For some specs, your Biblio here has a 2.875 inch blade. The knife overall is 6.75 inches long, and it weighs 3.77 ounces, which you might recognize is pretty heavy for a knife that is this small. The blade is M390. Giant Mouse does not mark their blades with the blade steel, or at least didn't at this point. It's got a satin finish, pretty typical belt satin there, and it's 0.12 inches thick, which is pretty typical for an EDC knife, neither thin nor thick. You got a sheep's foot style blade here with a pretty broad gradual belly and a tall, almost full flat grind. It's not quite a full flat grind. You can see there's some flat up there. And then because of this big belly, your tip actually ends up a little bit above the pivot. So it's a little bit of sort of a upswept sheep's foot. If you were to kick this whole blade shape down, it would be very clearly a sheep's foot. It almost looks like a leaf-shaped blade, but really this is a sheep's foot that has been angled upward a little bit, which is a really interesting blade shape. And Giant Mouse is a collaboration between a business partner and then Jesper Voxnæs and Jens Anso, who are 2 very well-known Danish custom knife designers. And this has tons of Voxnæs' design language in it. This tall, stubby blade is straight out of Vox's general catalog. A lot of the lines here and the general chunky, heavy-duty feeling of the knife is very Jesper Voxnæs. He likes to make tough, chunky, stubby little knives that are relatively short, but are relatively capable. He also likes to make blades that start with relatively thick blade stock and come down to a very thick cutting edge with these tall grinds. This has a lot of it. Voxnays is designed to become even more popular in the general EDC and production knife community than they were back when this came out. Urban EDC Supply has done like 7 collaborations with Vox by this point, but this came out, a lot of people were still learning about Vox's design language. And honestly, I still think this is one of the best iterations of it. So opening methods, you've got here, on the blade here, you've got some jimping right here. Why is the jimping up there? Jimping is up there. There's another Vox signature, so that when you put your thumb right there, it sits right on that jimping. So when you're gripping the knife like this, your thumb sits on the jimping and it ends up being very secure and very natural and keeps your hand oriented over the blade, which gives you tons of control. Even though this blade is only 1200 or 0.12 inches thick, again, it keeps that thickness relatively far out, not a ton of distal taper, none until about here. And then it actually does come down to a pretty thin tip right there. So you get a relatively stout blade that still has a thin and piercy tip. Your blade spine is crowned just a little bit. You've got 2 opening methods here. You've got a flipper with a pretty sharp flipper tab that's got some pretty aggressive jimping there. And then you've also, which works just fine. And then you've got this opening hole right here, which is not knocked down. It's pretty sharp all around the edges. Works very nicely for a thumb roll. And then you can Spidey flick it. I'm not so good at the Spidey flick, but it works just fine for that. So this can be slow rolled, reverse flicked, and it can be opened with that flipper. Detent is on the lighter side, but it's more than sufficient for the action to get a decent action out of this. This is a liner lock. You can see your liner lock right there. There's your inset, or there's your, I shouldn't say inset, but there's your liner lock, and then there's some pretty aggressive jimping on that liner lock, which bites your finger when you want to disengage it. This is running on bearings, and you can sort of see those bearings in there, and I believe that most Biblios, if not all Biblios, are running on bearings. Looking at these handles, you've got aggressively contoured micarta handles here. And one of the notable things about this knife is that those liners are not inset. So if I compare to something like your riv here, you can see there are liners in this riv. Easier to see if you flip this out. You can see there's a steel liner in there, but they're inset. They're set so that they're behind the micarta here. Instead, on this early version of the Biblio, your micarta scales are sitting entirely proud of the liners. That is part of why this knife is so chunky and so thick. Also, when you look at those liners, you can see there is no internal milling. So you got thick piece of steel here and then micarta sitting on top of that. You've got some very aggressive lines on this handle. You've got a very nice front finger choke, rounding and crowning right there. Can get a full finger in there. Then you've got a very large front indexing notch here. And then some pretty aggressive lines in general toward the back. This pinches very heavily. Whole thing swoops down. Basically gives a space for, if you're choked back, 2 to 3 fingers to fit in this notch here. Probably 2 fingers if your hands are not small. I got relatively small hands. And if you're choking up on the blade, then you're basically going to get your middle finger in that notch and then 2 fingers back here. This butt of the knife has a relatively sharp corner there that's designed to keep your hands in place. And then again, this whole thing is contoured, so you got a little bit of that river rock sort of feel in the hand when you grip it. All right, so yes, you've got micarta scales over steel liners here. You got standoffs on the back. This is one of Giant Mouse's knives. They often use backspacers. This one is just standoffs. They are probably steel. I didn't check. And then sort of last detail, this is made in Maniago, Italy, which is where most of Giant Mouse's early knives were made. And as we get into the fit and finish, that's not necessarily the best quality in the world. So design-wise, this is basically meant to be a tough, stout EDC. This is a Jesper Voxnays design through and through. It's meant to be a knife that is small, short, but that you can beat on. And so we'll talk about it within that context, how well it operates there. This is meant to be a big knife. This isn't meant to be a delicate knife, though we will compare it to some more delicate knives as we're thinking about it, because this is still only a 3-inch blade, and so a lot of the stuff you will be using instead might be more delicate stuff. Let's finish with some size comparisons, and let's start with the Delica, right on that note there. And you'll see this is even shorter than the Delica, both a little shorter in the handle and a little shorter in the blade. That said, when you fold it up here and we look on the other dimension, it is hilariously thicker than the Delica. You can see it's almost twice as thick as the Delica. It's also much bigger, just taller in general than the Delica. So even though it's a slightly shorter knife, it feels like a bigger knife in the pocket than the Delica. Let's compare to your Para 3, which it is almost a dead ringer for the Para 3 in size. And because, you know, the Para 3 is a relatively chunky small knife as well, it's about the same overall size. Still thicker, though only, actually no, it's quite a bit thicker than the Para 3. So yeah, still thicker than the Para 3. And by the way, the number here, this is 58 thousandths thick. It's over half an inch thick, which is just very, very thick. If you compare it to a Para 2, much smaller than the Para 2. You compare it to a small Sabenza, about the same size as your small Sabenza here in both the blade length and the handle length. Obviously a much different profile. And then I'll just bring out a large Sabenza for comparison as well, and you can see significantly smaller than that large Sabenza. So you've got a pretty typical EDC size, again around the same size as things like your small Sabenza or your Para 3. A lot of those typical EDC knives, it's just a chunky version of it. So, specifications out of the way. What does the Biblio do well? The first thing is this blade. This blade is a fantastic EDC blade. So it's a short, tall blade with an aggressive grind that comes down to a very sharp cutting edge. Again, your stock is not starting all that thick, 12 thousandths, lots of room to drop, and a fairly aggressive grind. If you look sort of down, you can see how thin this knife gets, not just at the edge, it stays thin pretty far up. This is a very, very sharp knife. And even though the edge is not bad, but there's nothing spectacular about the edge, but it is sufficiently thin behind the edge that this just cuts really, really well. This has a great bite. Especially, you know, you really feel how well the blade bites when you're using it on lighter weight stuff, trying to cut through flimsier tape or cut through paper or do some scoring cuts down on a table. Also, you know, plant matter, trying to cut plant stems, things like that. This thing bites. This thing bites like a Spyderco native or something like that. Even a little better sometimes. It is a very sharp knife. And this blade shape here, which again basically is a sheep's foot that is turned up a little bit, is really natural and easy to use for lots of EDC tasks. You can pinch up on the knife very easily. You can either grab it just like this and put your thumb on there when you want a little more push, a little more leverage, or very easily pinch up on the blade. If you want to get down on a table like that, very easy to get up to this tip and do your utility cuts, your drag cuts, things like that. If you're holding something and you want to, say, cut an apple or cut, you know, shape a grape, whatever you want, very easy to control this blade, very easy to get to that edge and do all those sorts of cuts. Fantastic for twine. You can, you know, pull a piece of twine, cut it just like that, cut through just like that. Great for plant material. Worked very, very well as a gardening knife, easy to get in and around stuff. The sharpness very much helps, so you don't have to apply a lot of force to cut things. It's a really, really functional blade shape. The way they handle the blade stock is really nice. 12 thousandths is not thin. It's thicker than something like a Delica. You can see even in this DLC one that it's significantly thicker. It's about the same as something like a small Sabenza, and it's thinner than something like a Para 3, which actually has quite thick blade stock for a knife its size. But again, it carries that blade stock thickness pretty far out before aggressively slimming down right toward the tip. What that means is that this becomes a little knife that you can work. It doesn't feel delicate. This doesn't feel like something that you have to worry about pushing it too hard. Anything that you would realistically be using a 2.87 .875 inch blade for, this is going to be up for the task. You think about it again, your TRM Neutron is another comparison. Your Neutron has a thin blade. It feels a little delicate. This does not feel delicate in any way. The feeling I sort of got when I was using this is very similar to a Hinder half track, in that it's a little tank of a knife that, unlike the half track, actually is thin behind the edge, so it actually cuts. And basically, just in sum, this is a really, really good user blade. Works well for your tasks around the house. I would cut through drywall with this. I could cut through all sorts of fibrous or rough materials with this quite easily. Gives you lots of control. It's just a really well-designed blade that gives you a great balance between sharpness and toughness and accessibility of that tip, accessibility of that edge. There's enough belly that when you want to do your longer slicing cuts like you do when you cut through cardboard, whether it's a drag cut or a push cut, it works really well. It's just a fantastically designed blade. It's one of the best blade shapes I think that I have ever used for general EDC tasks. Really impressive in use. And then the other part, which is unexpected, not unexpected, in fact it is very expected from a Jesper Voxnäs design knife, is that the ergonomics are fantastic, especially in this choked up grip. This grip here, with your finger in the front choil, and your middle finger there, and then your two fingers hanging on the back, thumb up on this jimping, this feels about as secure in the hand as any 3-inch knife is ever going to feel. It just, with this sway back here, with how deep this choil is, how deep this finger index is, the fact that all this contoured scale rolls right into the palm, this is locked in. You can push this knife hard. I mean, you can really grab this, bear down on it. I'm gripping this as hard as I can. There's no hot spots or anything like that. And I have pushed this knife hard, and it will stay secure in your hand in a way that very few knives of this size do. It's part of the reason that this knife ends up feeling like a knife that can handle much more than most 3-inch, certainly sub 3-inch knives, is because these locked-in ergonomics are so strong that you can push this knife harder than you can. There are obviously limitations of what you can do with a 3-inch blade. There are many things where 3 inches is just not enough blade length to cut through the material you want to cut through. There's also times where just from a leverage perspective, it's not that great. If you're cutting through long, huge sheets of cardboard, you often want a longer blade so the cut can more naturally sort of follow the arc of your arm, things like that. But for stuff where it's just a rough material or a hard cut or a heavy cut or something like that, this works great. This is as secure in the hand as something like, a PM2 or even, a Demco AD 20.5, some of the best ergonomic knives out there. And frankly, I can't think of another knife this size that is this secure in the hand. If I compare this to the Para 3, which is another relatively chunky small knife, you can see similar lines in that you've got a front choil, then a swell right here, and then a couple sort of swells toward the end. The Biblio feels much more secure in the hand than your Para 3. Just really, really strong ergonomics, especially in that choked up, especially in that choked up grip. This grip back here, where you're holding everything behind your flipper tab, you do feel a little bit far from the blade, and this choil will get in your way. You'll often be doing cuts and stuff will fall into the choil. So it's a little annoying, but it's there when you need that leverage. This is a 4-finger grip for me. For most people, it's probably a 3-finger grip if you've got larger hands than I do. But between that blade and the ergonomics, what you end up getting is a hyper-functional 3-inch knife in use. It cuts really well. It's still got the robustness you need to push it hard, and it will feel great in the hand while you're doing it. And you combine that great ergonomics with that great blade with a very slicey edge, and you've got something that is just effortless to use for both your lightweight EDC tasks where that sharpness really shines, and for your more heavy duty tasks where the ergonomics really help it work. On top of that, I've neglected to mention it earlier, because this is a very even flat grind, and because this sort of transition over to the saber grind is very seamless, and you got a nice sleek belt satin here, and the stock is not that thick. It worked very well passing through material. Even if you got to drag this through a big sheet of cardboard, you're not feeling a lot of drag on that blade. So it's just a great functional knife, especially in that sub 3-inch range. Where does the Biblio struggle? Well, there's a consequence for all this ergonomics, which is this thing is a huge, chunky knife in the pocket relative to most 3-inch knives. These are big, thick, contoured micarta scales over, again, unmilled, unlightened steel liners. This is more than half an inch thick. Like literally if I just put your para 3 here, you can see, and the contour sort of hides it, but you can see this is way thicker than the para 3, which is not a thin knife. If I take out a Delica and put it down here, you can see it is so much thicker than something like a Delica. It is way thicker than something like a Chris Reeve small Sabenza. It is just a very, very thick knife. It is also a very heavy knife at 3.77 ounces for a sub 3-inch blade. And so the result is that even though this is a short, small knife, this feels like a brick in the pocket. It actually because it's so dense, it feels very much like carrying like a river rock or a small brick in your pocket. It's not a pocket hog in the same sense of something like the Manix, where it takes up the whole pocket. It's more just like this, you'll feel it swinging around everywhere as you walk. It's big, it's chunky, it's thick, it's heavy. It's not a pleasant carry. We're a little spoiled these days for how many light, thin, sub 3-inch knives we have, but we absolutely do have many great options around this size range that give you a lot of performance while taking up very little space in the pocket. But even to look at a knife that was popular around this same time, you got your Southern Grind Spider Monkey here, which is only a slightly bigger knife. Quite a bit thinner. And these are both sort of, for lack of a better term, second-tier brands that were popular designs around the same time. Even though this is an older knife design, and that explains some of why it's so chunky, even by the standards of the time it came out, this was a thick, chunky knife that really prioritized those in-hand ergonomics over the in-pocket experience, but the consequence is you get poor in-pocket, you get a poor in-pocket experience. This just doesn't carry well. And the real problem with that is that it feels very much, especially in 2024, like an unforced error. And that's for two reasons, both of which I've mentioned in brief. First off, these liners, they could make this knife so much thinner and so much just nicer, and especially easier to carry if they took these thick contoured scales and just nested these liners inside of it and cinched those scales on top of the liners. Then you would lose, a 1/10 of an inch off the thickness of this knife, and it would feel so much better in the pocket, and I don't think it would lose much in the way of ergonomics. And in fact, as I showed before, that is what they've done with the Riv, the baby Biblio. You can see there's no exposed liners there, and the Riv, as a result, ends up being very significantly thinner, even though each individual micarta scale is almost exactly as thick. And so there were a lot of exposed liners back when this design first came out. They are basically, everybody's using inset liners these days, and that's for a good reason. It's just a better design in almost all cases, unless you're really using those exposed liners for either aesthetics or shadow boxing, where it's really important to the ergonomic experience. But the second part is these unmilled steel liners. That's just not really considered acceptable in 2024. That they could probably shave half an ounce off this knife if they were to aggressively mill out these liners. And that would make a big difference. Even a 1/4 ounce would make a big difference, not just in making this knife lighter and easier to carry, but because this handle is so heavy, this is the balance of this knife is very heavily toward the handle. It feels like you're holding a handle that happens to have a blade coming out of it. It's actually really nice when you're pushing it hard. It makes it feel very secure in the hand for those more aggressive, heavier duty cuts. But it does make some of the precise cuts, unless you really choke up, it makes them a little more difficult because, when you're gripping up on the knife, that handle is sort of it's just controlling the blade a little bit more than you might want. And it makes the balance of this knife feel just a little more handle heavy than you might like. So those combine to be sort of the biggest issue with the Biblio in general. It's chunky, it's heavy, that makes it feel like a bit of a relic. The other major issue with the Biblio is the action. So again, this was a giant mouse that was made a few years back in Maniago, Italy. And one of the things that all these Maniago knives had is they all had terrible actions. And the Biblio is no exception. When this knife came to me, the action was bad. It was gritty, it felt like there was literally sand in the pivot. And it would not open smoothly at all. I lubed it a bit. I just used it. I worked on it. I flipped it a bunch of times, and eventually it did smooth out. So now you have a controlled action. There's a little grittiness on the open and the close, but it's mostly controlled now. But it's still not a good action. This is a bearing action that feels like a decent washer action. There's nothing fast about this, and there's nothing that smooth about it. It just kind of is. It just opens and closes. It's not bad, but there's nothing good about it. And for a bearing action, you would sort of want it to be a little bit faster. And on top of that, we know now that Giant Mouse Maniago Italy can make fast bearing actions because they're doing it today. This was the Rio. I recorded a review of this not long ago. The Rio is made in Maniago, has bearings, and has a fast, snappy action. Feels a little rattly to me, but there's no play. It works very well. There's nothing fast or snappy about the action on the Biblio. So this is action that starts bad and gets to be mediocre after a lot of time working on it. The actual, deployment methods, it's a very sharp flipper tab, so it's a little pokey, but it is very well designed. I love how much it catches your finger. It's very easy to flip this out. Again, it's not the strongest detent in the world, but you get so much leverage with this flipper tab that it flies out very reliably. It's very satisfying to flip. And this is a great shape for an opening hole. Both it's visually interesting, it's kind of a Giant Mouse signature, and it catches your thumb very nicely. I particularly like this knife for the slow roll. And then on top of that, that flipper tab is part of why this front choil and this finger index are so good. The deployment methods are fine. I wish the detent was just a hair stronger, but it's fine. It's not a problem. It's just really the internals of that action are not as good as it could be. One of the other things you see is, and again, this is part of its era, you've got relatively large gaps there between the blade and those steel liners. And again, if we bring out our riv here, you'll see those gaps are at least a little bit smaller on the riv. And if you take out something like, and obviously it's a washer action, but if you look at something like a Spyderco, you'll see how closely Spyderco nests its blade into its liners. That is those gaps and how both how easily stuff can get in there and how everything just isn't quite tightly fit together. That's part of what is contributing, I believe, to this mediocre action. And so areas that this knife struggles, it's big, it's chunky, it's heavy in the pocket, and the action is okay at best. And honestly, if you're getting one factory fresh, it's probably going to be outright bad until you break it in. That has been my experience with many Giant Mouses from this era. Which brings us to construction and value. So this is a $185 knife, or this sold for $185 back when it was regularly selling. Honestly, would probably be right around $200 with a little bit of inflation that has happened since then. You can still find one or two versions of this at the versions of the Biblio at that $185 price point if you really do look around. The versions with the slab-sided scales in titanium or brass or bronze, those tend to run $235 or $265. Again, this is made in Italy, and the construction overall is fine. The blade is very nicely ground. The crowning is nice. The jimping is very good. They didn't knock down this opening hole, but they didn't mean to, and that's, it catches your finger more sharply. They have started doing that on their more recent knives, but that was their consistent choice back then. So that's a choice, not a fit and finish issue. The plunge is nicely done. The crowning on your front finger choil is well done. Your factory edge, even. Your blade grind is even. Etching for your logo is nicely done, consistent. Your contouring on the scales is very nice and consistent and even. There's even some additional beveling beyond the contouring. Your liners sit relatively neatly and evenly inside your scales. It's the same gap everywhere. Your standoffs are nicely fit and finish. Everything, and your hardware, it's all domed hardware. It's relatively custom to Giant Mouse by the looks of it. Evenly set into the scale. Nothing is more proud than anything else. It's not a complicated design, though this contouring and this overall handle shape is pretty, there's a lot of curves going on. It's not a complicated design, and it's done fine. As I sort of mentioned with this blade gap here, nothing is super tight. Nothing feels razor sharp. Nothing feels like it's really trying to be very precise. There's just a general feeling of, okay, it's put together well. But then you get into things like the action, and stuff like that reveals when, okay, everything probably could be a little more tightly put together, a little bit better finished than it is. The fit and finish is fine. It won't be an issue other than that issue with the action. It's fine. The price point, on one hand, it feels a little expensive. On the other hand, it doesn't. The level of fit and finish you're getting here does feel, $185 does feel a little expensive. Not necessarily the materials. I'm okay with my Cardin M390 at $185, but you'll find a lot of knives at $185. Again, let me take out my Para 3. The Para 3, the overall fit, finish, and tightness on the Para 3, it feels like a nicer, more professionally finished knife than your Biblio. And these are not in Maximate, but if you're getting this in a non-super steel, these are approximately the same price from a design perspective. They're in the ballpark. And the Para 3 feels substantially nicer. And these days, Spydercos are not cheap knives anymore. So with the Para 3 feeling like a more premium, more nicely finished knife than the Biblio at that price point, it's just really a way of saying $185 feels a little expensive for the Biblio, but as I said in the good about this knife, this is an exceptionally useful EDC knife. The blade is fantastically useful. The handle is fantastically ergonomic. And if I think about, okay, are there, if you want a thick, chunky EDC, a sub 3-inch knife that you can push really hard, are there better options at or around $185? I'm not really sure that there are. And that's sort of the problem with the price point is, yes, that price feels a little cheap when you look at it from a fit finish materials perspective, but I can't even necessarily tell you that there is something else that I would point you to instead that is a better buy at $185 for what this knife does. In fact, the only other options that I might direct you to are either other Giant Mouse knives or other designs that Jesper Voxnäs has done for other manufacturers. He's done some for Fox knives that I haven't tried personally and probably have the same fit and finish issues as this one. But there are a couple of Fox designs that look like very compelling designs. And there's also a bunch of designs he's done with Urban EDC Supply that have a lot of the same sort of design genealogy as this, and most of those are made by Riot or Bestech, and so the fit and finish is going to be a little bit better than what you've got here, and often they're even a little bit cheaper. But the fact is, from a function perspective, this is a you're getting a lot of utility for your $185 here. It's just, you're not necessarily getting something that feels $185 in niceness. Now, that's part of the reason I would love to see Giant Mouse, and let's jump to our conclusions. What I would love to see is Giant Mouse come out with a Biblio V2. They've done this with some of their knives before. I just reviewed the Ace Sonoma V2, and that addressed some of the major and minor issues with the V1. The Nimbus is on V3. Now the Biblio, again, they've made the Riv, the mini Biblio, which I'm going to review, and spoiler alert, this is a fantastic knife. And they've done the Biblio XL, which actually seems to address some of my major issues with the Biblio. They inset the liners on that one. It looks like the fit and finish is just tuned up a little bit more, and it looks like they're relatively lighter knives for the size they've got. I'm excited to try one of those out. But this knife as it stands right now is a really useful, really good knife, but with a couple major caveats. Honestly, the summary is that it feels dated. It's a wonderful design that feels dated in a way that not every knife from that age does. Yeah, now pull out my Delica. The Delica design has been around since at least the 90s. And does it feel a little dated relative to Spyderco's catalog? Yeah, but it's still a super useful knife that lots of people love. The Para 3 has been around longer than the Biblio, but still feels, it's still many people's favorite Spyderco. The Biblio, this version of the Biblio, the only way that you can excuse how chunky it is, how heavy it is, and that level of fit and finish, the grittiness and the action, all that for the price they're charging, is to give it the excuse of saying, well, this wasn't that bad back when it came out. But in 2024, if this knife came out in 2024, people would be ripping it apart for those major caveats. And that's unfortunate because this design, both the blade design and the handle design, is phenomenal. This in the hand and while you're using it might be the single best sub 3-inch knife I've handled for the specific things that this is designed to be really good at, which is to be exceptional at those EDC utility tasks like opening box and stuff like that, while still being able to be pushed really hard. It's just phenomenal at that stuff. The ergonomics are really at the top of the pack. This blade design is one of the best blade designs that I have had the pleasure of using. It's just an extraordinarily well-designed knife. Now, those slab-sided versions of the Biblio, I'm expecting some of these lines might end up a little sharp in the way that they aren't with these contoured scales, but I'll have to hold my opinions until I try one of those. I'm trying to get my hands on one at some point. But even those, they're still obviously, and I did handle one of those years ago. It's just I can't withdraw fully from memory. Those still have a bit of the old ricketiness to them. What I would love to see, a full Biblio V2, redo this design with their modern manufacturing quality. Because again, Giant Mouse has figured out, even from their Italian factory, to get significantly better performance, significantly better fit and finish. This is a design that deserves to have the best possible production version of it made, and this is not it. That all said, even with all those caveats, if what you want is a hard use EDC, if you want something that is like your Para 3, and you're okay with it being a little chunky, you want it to be hand filling, even if that means pocket filling, you're not a stickler for fit and finish, and you're either willing to pay a little bit more from the primary market, or you're willing to buy from the secondary market where these regularly go for like $120, in which case they're a great buy, then the Biblio is still a really good knife. It's going to have quirks that a lot of really good modern EDC choices don't have. But those ergonomics are so good, that blade is so good, that if you know what you're looking for, there's still a ton to enjoy even in this flawed iteration of it. those are my thoughts on the giant Mouse Ace Biblio. This has been Clark the Knife. I hope you found this informative and useful. Please drop any comments, thoughts, questions, or feedback below, and I will see you again soon.